Hi, I'm Dr. B, and welcome to my brief history of advertising. The first thing that I'd like you to know is that the history of advertising is very close to the history of mass media. And in order to understand what that means, I think that we need to talk about a few big concepts. So the first one, obviously, is advertising. What is advertising? Mara Einstein defines advertising as a paid communication used to persuade someone to buy a product or service of an identified sponsor. It could also be a paid communication to do other things, like encourage voters to support a particular political candidate or support the idea of a different brand identity. If you're just a consumer and you're trying to forge a relationship with a brand, advertising is one of those things that can help you decide which brand you're going to do. Are you a PC person or are you a Mac person? Advertising helps you decide, even if you never really buy either product. Pope points out that advertising is usually a mediated persuasion, which is to say it's different than direct person-to-person sales. So when somebody at a jewelry counter is trying to sell you a piece of jewelry, that's not advertising, but it is a message that's intended to sell something. When we think about the idea of mediated persuasion, we also need to talk about mediation. So what is that? Well, mediation is what happens when, for instance, communication happens through a medium or a channel that sort of gets in the way, might transform the symbols that we share back and forth with one another. This lecture right now is mediated through the internet using digital technologies and a web camera, and this is different than a face-to-face interaction, which some people would call unmediated because we don't have a screen in between us. Medium comes from Latin, meaning the middle, so just think about mediation as a kind of process where something comes through in the middle and might filter things a little bit. In communication studies, when we talk about media, we're usually talking about mass media or perhaps the mainstream national news media or something like that. But in this class, it's more helpful if you think about media as communication technologies, like different ways that we consume communication and different ways that we receive advertising messages. So a newspaper ad is different than an ad that you see on TikTok. These have to do with the mediation taking place and different capacities of the media or communication technologies as far as advertisers can use them. So when we are thinking about the media of advertising content, it's helpful to break things up a little bit, although the divisions are getting blurry in part because people maybe don't buy cable anymore or don't watch broadcast news. But generally in the past, when we think about the history of communication technologies, we think about things like print ads and print media like magazines and newspapers or direct-to-consumer mail that you'd receive in your mailbox. We also think about broadcast content, such as what we get on radio waves or on airwaves for our television, if that's how we consume our television. And then there's digital content, which can be either static, like an image that you see when you're scrolling on Instagram, or video-based, like a video that you see when you're on your other social media streams. These digital ads are technically also what we see when we're on Hulu and we see an ad break. That's a digitally delivered video ad. So the structure of the ad works like a television ad, but the access point is digital instead of through broadcast television. So things get a little bit hairy in the details there, but you can think about it as a still image that you can hold close to you and get a lot of content from, or a small movie and a moving image with sound. These are the kinds of distinctions that's worth making. So television commercials, moving images with sound, which you might get on TV or you might get on your phone, are good at encouraging emotions because there's sight and sound and a story, and it reminds us of the experience of going to the movies or watching a show. Print advertising you can think of more like these static images, and these are good at explaining complex concepts or giving more detail about a product. But I think you're all also aware of like tutorial ads, and those are things that you might see again digitally. Then there's outdoor advertising like billboards, and these are good for keeping things front of mind. So if you're on a road trip with your family and you see a billboard for McDonald's and it's 5 miles away, that reminds you that you could go eat at McDonald's, but it doesn't tell you anything about McDonald's. You just know that McDonald's has fries, right? Something else that is good to know about advertising before we start thinking about the history of advertising is that everyone is influenced by it, but it can be a little bit tricky to decide or determine how we are influenced by advertising. So we're swimming in a sea of symbols and we're getting influenced by the stuff that we encounter, but it's not always a direct, obvious relationship between exposure to an ad and consumer behavior, or perhaps social behaviors, which might be reflected by the content of the ads or shaped by the content of the ads. So if you see the beer ads for the most interesting man in the world, you and your friends might joke about being the most interesting person in the world. That's a social change, but you might not buy that beer brand, you know? So advertising does influence us culturally and perhaps in our consumer patterns, but it's not always a zero-sum game. Ad equals purchase. It's more complicated than that. Another thing worth knowing is that advertising has been around for a very long time. Now, what I'm about to tell you is apocryphal. That means it's a story that may or may not be true, but it's a fun story that some people tell when they try and trace the first or oldest known advertisement. And you should know also that this story is disputed because there are some people who trace the origins of advertising many other places, including, for instance, ancient China, where people playing flutes might advertise candies to people as they were walking around on the street. So it's very ambiguous. It doesn't really matter what the first advertisement was, but here's a funny story. So this is an example of what is considered perhaps the oldest known advertisement. It's found on the Marble Way in Turkey, which was formerly part of the Roman Empire. And so this was on a road. And evidently, some current scholars have diagnosed this image to say that it contains a cross, which I can't find, a woman, which I can't find, a heart, which I believe we can find over here, a foot, that's very obvious, a library, maybe this, a money purse, who knows, and a hole. We can find the hole, it's right here. So there's one interpretation of this that suggests that this image shows the location of a brothel, and it says, more or less, if your foot is at least this big, you're old enough to go to the brothel. Go over that way. But you need to make sure you have enough coins to fill that hole, or else you can't pay for the companionship that the sex workers can offer you. And if you aren't old enough, and if you can't pay, why don't you go on over to the library? So that's the joke, the apocryphal story about perhaps the oldest known advertisement in the world. You can take it or leave it. I just think it's kind of fun to tell a story about how sex work really has been with us for all time. It's, slightly off color to tell that joke, but here I am doing it anyway. On the internet. So there you have it. That's the perhaps myth about the oldest advertisement on the planet. And now I'm going to orient us more towards thinking about the history of mass media and how that has influenced advertising. So mass media, think about this as something that can be produced on a large scale and reach a very big audience at more or less the same time. That's how we were thinking about mass media. Newspapers and magazines were the first venues for what we would consider contemporary advertisements, and we can see this in the United States going back to colonial America. So in the 18th century in the United States, we could see advertisements in things like political magazines or gazettes, and there were newspapers, but they weren't newspapers the same way that we understand them now. So if you were part of a club or a society, there might be a publication circulated for members of that club or society or members of a political party. So in colonial America, we could see certain ads for things like imported goods for England, which people were critical of because they didn't want to be overly dependent on England. This is sort of at the time people were deciding whether or not to break off and form a new country with the United States. And then something that historians find very interesting, which is very uncomfortable to look at today, but worth acknowledging and facing, is that early advertisements also included notices regarding enslaved individuals who were part of black chattel slavery in the United States. So you can also find interesting historical texts looking at the very deep history of advertising, and it does give us a clear picture of what society was like at the time. Moving forward a little bit, we can see in the 19th century that newspapers, as we know them, did start to emerge. And these first ones that really influenced advertising are called penny papers sometimes. The idea is that they only cost a penny compared to their competitors, which cost about 6 cents each. So the penny papers used tabloid methods, really juicy gossip, sometimes not true at all, in order to attract readers and perhaps get some advertising revenue. So the first person who advertised this way was Benjamin Day, and he sold his papers at a loss with free advertising to tell advertisers that it was worth paying money for his services, and that did work out well for him. The ads that we saw at this time were very simple. There were very few mass-produced products, so it wasn't necessarily critical for people to advertise on a large scale a product they could only produce on a small scale. So once products and product production, once production really scaled up and we had industrialized production of a lot more products, then we saw advertising taking off at a much higher rate. Original ads were very simple, but as similar products were produced using similar methods, we saw a lot of ads getting more sophisticated to try and convince people that there was, in fact, something different about this brand as opposed to that brand. They're all canned beans, but maybe the one with a Jolly Green Giant on it is more appealing in part because of that brand identity. But that doesn't come until later. A few of the things I'm going to talk about here are coming from Tim Wu's book, The Attention Merchants, and this is something that I have assigned in previous years in different iterations of this class, but I'm pulling out some of the best parts for the purpose of giving you this timeline right now. So Tim Wu talks about the history of large-scale attention harvesting and the way that people who sell cultural products like newspapers and TV shows have managed to bundle in product placement and advertisements with their entertainment. So whenever we are entertained, we are also usually being sold to. So Tim Wu talks about this moment when Benjamin Day decided to sell his newspaper, the New York Sun, at a loss and give free advertising to companies until they saw the light. And this worked really well for Benjamin Day. But something that's worth knowing is that the content that he produced was pretty bad and very juicy and kind of classist. Benjamin Day himself was anti-slavery, so it is fortunate that he used his platform to help encourage people to change their point of view about enslavement. But he also maybe told stories about folks who had escaped slavery, and he would tell the stories in like really, really salacious ways. So this kind of thing happened in his papers too. The most egregious thing that Benjamin Day did in his paper was the Great Moon Hoax, which was a fake story about, I think, a scientist who didn't exist, who supposedly lived in, I want to say, Scotland, and had a powerful telescope that allowed him to see bat people on the moon. Obviously, none of this is real. The whole thing was a hoax, but newspapers were flying off the racks because people were so fascinated with the possibility that maybe there were moon people. It's pretty funny to look at now in hindsight, but we do still have publications like the National Enquirer that have similar hoaxy material. But Benjamin Day didn't do it alone. He had an adversary who was another big personality in the advertising industry, James Gordon Bennett Sr. He's considered a troll. He had very different political views to Benjamin Day. He had competing papers, and he extended Day's business model. Both of them together helped solidify the idea of the penny press as one of the main and earliest sources of large-scale advertising. I'm going to pause here and see you soon.